Confederate cultural narcissism is a term used to describe the ideology that underpinned the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War. This ideology was based on the belief that white people, specifically those of Anglo-Saxon descent, were superior to all other races, and that this superiority entitled them to own slaves and maintain a separate society. The Confederacy was founded on the principle of states' rights, which in practice meant that individual states had the power to decide whether or not to allow slavery within their borders. Many Southern states chose to secede from the United States when it became clear that the federal government intended to restrict the expansion of slavery. The Confederate Constitution explicitly protected the institution of slavery and enshrined white supremacy as a fundamental principle. Confederate cultural narcissism was fueled by a number of factors, including the economic importance of slavery to the Southern economy, the romanticization of the Old South as a place of chivalry and honor, and a sense of aggrieved victimhood among Southern whites who felt that they were under attack from Northern abolitionists and federal authorities. This narcissistic worldview was reflected not only in the institution of slavery itself, but also in the way that Southern culture was constructed and propagated. Literature, art, and popular culture all reinforced the idea that white Southerners were a superior race, and that the preservation of their way of life was a noble and just cause. This cultural narcissism contributed to the perpetuation of slavery and the justification of the horrors that it inflicted upon African Americans. The legacy of Confederate cultural narcissism is still felt in the United States today. The debate over Confederate monuments and symbols, for example, reflects a larger struggle over the meaning of the Civil War and the role of race in American history. Some argue that these symbols represent a proud Southern heritage and should be preserved, while others see them as glorifying a racist and oppressive regime. One of the most egregious examples of the harm caused by Confederate cultural narcissism was the forced removal of Native American peoples from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson, paved the way for the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. This policy was driven by the same belief in white superiority that underpinned slavery, and it resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. The same ideology that underpinned Confederate cultural narcissism also influenced Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. The Nazis were explicitly racist and anti-Semitic, and they saw themselves as a superior race that was entitled to dominate and control other peoples. The Nazis were inspired by American laws and policies that promoted racial segregation, forced sterilization of people deemed unfit, and immigration restrictions that targeted non-white and non-Protestant groups. The Nazi regime looked to the United States as a model for how to create a racially homogeneous society, and they were particularly interested in the Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation in the American South. Nazi officials studied these laws and were impressed by the way that white Southerners had managed to maintain a rigid racial hierarchy despite the abolition of slavery. The Nazi regime also drew on American eugenics policies, which were designed to improve the genetic quality of the population by promoting the reproduction of fit individuals and preventing the reproduction of unfit individuals. These policies led to the forced sterilization of thousands of people, many of whom were deemed mentally deficient or socially undesirable. The Nazis would later use similar policies to justify their own program of forced sterilization and eventually the Holocaust. In conclusion, Confederate cultural narcissism played a significant role in the perpetuation of slavery and the genocide of Native American peoples. Nazi cultural narcissism refers to the belief held by the Nazi regime that their culture was superior to all others, and that it was their duty to impose their values and ideals upon the world. This belief was rooted in the concept of racial purity, which held that only the Aryan race was capable of achieving greatness and that all other races were inferior. The Nazis used this belief to justify their actions, including the practice of slavery and the genocide of millions of people, including Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, homosexuals, and others who were deemed to be unworthy of life by Nazi standards. Slavery was an integral part of the Nazi regime's economic strategy, as they sought to exploit the labor of those they deemed inferior. They established forced labor camps throughout Europe, where prisoners were subjected to inhumane conditions, long hours of work, and brutal treatment. These prisoners were often worked to death or subjected to medical experiments, and many died from malnutrition, disease, or outright murder. Genocide was also a key component of the Nazi regime's ideology, as they sought to eliminate entire populations that they deemed to be undesirable. The most well-known example of this was the Holocaust, where millions of Jews were systematically murdered in concentration camps. However, the Nazis also targeted other groups, such as Romani people, disabled individuals, and homosexuals, among others. The Nazi regime's cultural narcissism was driven by a belief in their own superiority and a desire to impose their values and ideals upon the world. This narcissism was supported by a sophisticated propaganda machine, which portrayed the Nazis as heroes and the rest of the world as inferior. In conclusion, Nazi cultural narcissism was a major factor in the practice of slavery and genocide during the Holocaust. This belief in their own superiority led the Nazis to believe that they had the right to exploit and destroy those they deemed inferior, and it ultimately led to the deaths of millions of people. Understanding this concept is crucial to preventing similar atrocities from occurring in the future, and we must be vigilant in fighting against any form of cultural narcissism that may emerge in the world today. In the Rehoboam story, labor abuse is depicted through the king's decision to increase the workload of his subjects, despite their complaints and pleas for mercy. The king's arrogance and cultural narcissism are evident in his belief that he has the right to demand more from his subjects, without any consideration for their well-being or human rights. He sees himself as superior to his subjects, and therefore entitled to their labor, no matter the cost. Similarly, in the Exodus story, labor abuse is also rampant, with the Israelites being forced to work long hours under harsh conditions in Egyptian slavery. The Pharaoh's cultural narcissism is evident in his belief that he has the right to enslave an entire group of people and exploit them for his own gain. He views himself and his culture as superior to the Israelites and therefore entitled to their labor without any regard for their well-being. Both stories illustrate how cultural narcissism can lead to labor abuse, with those in power believing that they are entitled to the labor of others, regardless of the cost. The belief in cultural superiority can lead to a sense of entitlement that justifies the exploitation of others. The cultural narcissism of the pharaoh and the king blinds them to the humanity of their subjects, reducing them to mere tools for their own use. Moreover, in both stories, the labor abuse is justified by the idea that it is necessary for the greater good. The king believes that the increased workload will benefit the kingdom, while the pharaoh sees the Israelites as a necessary workforce for his empire. This utilitarian view of labor allows those in power to justify the exploitation of their subjects, with little regard for their suffering. In conclusion, the Rehoboam story and the Exodus story illustrate how cultural narcissism can lead to labor abuse, with those in power believing that they are entitled to the labor of others, regardless of the cost. The belief in cultural superiority can lead to a sense of entitlement that justifies the exploitation of others, reducing them to mere tools for the benefit of those in power. These stories serve as cautionary tales, warning against the dangers of cultural narcissism and the exploitation of labor. Cultural narcissism is a term that describes the tendency of individuals and groups to view their own cultural traditions and practices as superior to those of other cultures. This phenomenon can be observed in various aspects of life, including art, rituals, and clothing. In the realm of art, cultural narcissism can manifest in the belief that one's own culture produces the most beautiful and meaningful works of art. This can lead to a lack of appreciation for the art of other cultures, as well as a tendency to appropriate or imitate elements of those cultures without proper understanding or respect. For example, some Western artists have been accused of appropriating Native American or African art forms without proper acknowledgement or understanding of their cultural significance. In the context of rituals, cultural narcissism can take the form of a belief that one's own religious or cultural practices are the only valid ones. This can lead to a lack of respect for the beliefs and practices of others, as well as a tendency to view other cultures as inferior or barbaric. This attitude can be seen in the historical treatment of indigenous cultures by colonial powers, who sought to impose their own religious and cultural practices on native populations. Clothing is another area where cultural narcissism can manifest. This can take the form of a belief that one's own traditional clothing is superior to that of other cultures, or a tendency to appropriate or commodify elements of other cultures' dress. For example, the use of traditional Native American headdresses as fashion accessories by non-Native individuals has been widely criticized as disrespectful and appropriative. Cultural narcissism can have negative impacts on both individuals and societies. It can lead to a lack of empathy and understanding towards other cultures, as well as a tendency to view cultural diversity as a threat rather than a strength. Additionally, cultural narcissism can perpetuate inequalities and power imbalances between dominant and marginalized cultures. To combat cultural narcissism, it is important to cultivate a sense of cultural humility and respect for the diversity of human experiences. This involves acknowledging the limitations of one's own cultural perspective and actively seeking to learn from and engage with other cultures in a respectful and equitable manner. By doing so, we can create a more inclusive and compassionate world where all cultures are valued and celebrated. Patriarchy refers to a social system in which men hold power and dominance over women. This system has been present in many cultures and religions throughout history, and it continues to persist in some societies today. In this article, we will explore how religions and cultures use patriarchy, and the impact that it has on individuals and society as a whole. Religions and patriarchy. Religion has played a significant role in the formation and perpetuation of patriarchal systems. Many religious texts have been interpreted in ways that uphold the dominance of men over women. For example, in Christianity, the Bible has been used to justify male superiority and female subordination. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3, "But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." This passage has been used to justify the submission of women to men. Similarly, in Islam, the Quran has been interpreted by some to suggest that men are superior to women. For example, in Surah An-Nisa 4:34, it is written, "Men are the protectors and maintainers of women because Allah has given the one more than the other and because they support them from their means." This passage has been used to justify the idea that men have a natural right to authority over women. In Hinduism, patriarchy is also present in the caste system, which places men in higher social classes than women. This system has been used to justify the subordination of women and restrict their access to education, resources, and power. Cultures and patriarchy. Cultural practices and beliefs can also perpetuate patriarchy. For example, in many cultures, women are expected to fulfill traditional gender roles such as being a wife, mother, and homemaker. These roles often limit women's opportunities for education, employment, and political participation. In some cultures, female infanticide and dowry practices are still prevalent. Female infanticide refers to the killing of female babies, while dowry is a payment made by the bride's family to the groom's family at the time of marriage. These practices reinforce the idea that women are a burden on their families and that they are worth less than men. In some cultures, women are also subjected to harmful practices such as female genital mutilation and forced marriages. FGM is a practice that involves the partial or total removal of the external female genitalia. It is often performed without anesthesia and can result in severe physical and psychological trauma. Forced marriages, on the other hand, involve the coercion of individuals into marriage without their consent. These practices are used to control women's sexuality and maintain male dominance. Impact of patriarchy. The impact of patriarchy on individuals and society is profound. Women who are subjected to patriarchy often experience discrimination, violence, and limited opportunities for personal and professional growth. They are often forced to conform to traditional gender roles and face social and economic barriers that limit their potential. Patriarchy also harms men by perpetuating harmful stereotypes of masculinity, such as the idea that men should be aggressive and dominant. These stereotypes can lead to toxic behavior and contribute to a culture of violence and abuse. In conclusion, patriarchy is a pervasive social system that has been used by religions and cultures to justify male dominance over women. It harms individuals and society by limiting opportunities for personal and professional growth, perpetuating harmful stereotypes, and contributing to a culture of violence and abuse. It is important to recognize and challenge patriarchal systems to create a more just and equitable society for all. Religion has been a source of inspiration and guidance for people for centuries, and it has used various mediums to communicate its message to its audiences. From art to literature, music to wardrobe, and rituals to symbols, religion employs a variety of tools to convey its message to its followers. One of the most prominent ways religion communicates to its audience is through art. Religious art, such as paintings, sculptures, and murals, have been used to depict important religious figures, events, and ideas. These artworks serve as visual representations of religious beliefs and practices and are intended to evoke spiritual feelings and emotions in the viewer. Literature is another important medium that religion uses to communicate its message to its followers. Sacred texts such as the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah are revered by religious communities and are used as a means of instruction and guidance. Religious texts are also used in the form of parables, stories, and fables, which help to convey moral and ethical teachings. Music has been a powerful tool in religious communication for centuries. Religious songs and hymns are used in various religious rituals and ceremonies to evoke strong emotions and feelings of devotion among participants. These songs also serve as a means of expressing gratitude, praise, and supplication to a higher power. Wardrobe also plays a significant role in religious communication. Religious attire, such as the burqa, hijab, or cassock, serves as a visual symbol of religious affiliation and reinforces a sense of belonging within a particular religious community. It also serves as a reminder of religious teachings and values and is often used as a means of identifying individuals who adhere to specific religious beliefs. Rituals and symbols are also essential in religious communication. Religious rituals, such as prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage, serve as a means of connecting with a higher power and reinforce religious beliefs and practices. Symbols, such as the cross, the star and crescent, and the menorah, are used as visual representations of religious beliefs and are used in various religious ceremonies and rituals. In conclusion, religion employs various mediums, including art, literature, music, wardrobe, rituals, and symbols, to communicate its message to its followers. These mediums serve to evoke strong emotions and feelings of devotion, reinforce religious beliefs and practices, and reinforce a sense of belonging within a particular religious community.